The whispers, deep within the New York catacombs. The slow exploration of an unknown world beneath the city. The unsettling calm of Old St. Patrick's Yard. Elias secured the guide rope to a stable iron railing near the entrance, ensuring its knot was firm and dependable. This was a purely methodological step. The catacombs, though mapped, demanded respect for their treacherous depths. He didn't rush. Rushing was the enemy of archaeology and the antithesis of the quiet solitude he sought. With a deep, measured breath, a breath that tasted of the city's recent history, soon to be replaced by the breath of its distant past, Elias Thorne began his descent. The stone steps were worn and slick in patches, hollowed slightly in the center, where generations of sextons, mourners, and workmen had trod. His boots, heavy with the practical necessity of cave exploration, met the stone with a soft, dull thud, a sound swallowed instantly by the surrounding quiet. He moved as a clock moves, steadily, inevitably, allowing no haste to interfere with the necessary passage of time. Down, down, the beam of his headlamp cut a single, solitary tunnel through the darkness. The immediate change in temperature was dramatic. From the cool surface air to a sustained, chilling cold that felt like the permanent temperature of rock and decay. He passed the first turn, and the distant, muted sounds of traffic, the last vestiges of the living world, disappeared completely. He was now held fast in the soundless pocket of the dead. After perhaps 50 steps, the staircase leveled out into a narrow passageway. The architecture here was simple, almost brutal. Exposed brick, arching low overhead, built by laborers who were paid by the hour and driven by the fear of disease. This was the recorded section, the familiar territory. The walls were lined with rows of crypts, heavy slabs of marble or granite bearing the names of families whose legacies had long since faded above ground. The dates here mostly spanned from the 1820s to the 1860s. Names like Vanderpoel and Schuyler, names that once signified absolute power in Manhattan, were now merely cold carvings, silent witnesses to time. Elias walked slowly, his eyes trained not on the names but on the mortar between the bricks. He was searching for an anomaly, a break in the uniform pattern. A clue that the 19th century builders had stopped, hidden something, and then continued. The air grew stiller, heavier, in the true lightless dark. The human body begins to perceive things that are not there, and Elias's training taught him to filter these subtle perceptual errors. He was utterly alone, but the silence here was not empty. It was full of the compacted history of every person entombed. Every drop of moisture that had seeped through the stone, and every minute of every day that had passed in the absolute darkness. He stopped at a junction where a large, vaulted archway led into the main, expansive chamber, often used for tours. He bypassed it, moving instead down a smaller, more restricted corridor, marked by a faded sign, "Maintenance and storage only." This was the spine of the ancient construction, the core that had been built first. Here the air was different. It lacked the slight circulation provided by the wider tunnels. It was static, thick, and held a peculiar scent that Elias struggled to categorize. It was more than mildew and stone. It was the smell of compressed time, an odor of old chemicals, dry wood, and fine mineral dust that had not been stirred in over 150 years. He moved his GPR unit across the brickwork of the left wall, maintaining a steady, crawling pace. The small screen glowed faintly, showing him the density and structure beneath the visible surface. Most of the readings were uniform, solid rock or consistent brick density. But he was looking for a void, an echo, a sudden change in material composition that would betray the presence of an opening that should not be there. Thump, thump, thump. The only sound was the distant, almost inaudible drip of water. slowly eroding the ceiling in some forgotten corner, and the rhythmic, soft tap, tap, tap of his own footsteps. He measured the space with his eyes, counting the spans of brick, comparing the known width of the existing crypts to the overall span of the land above. The numbers did not quite align. There should have been room for one more vault or a narrow walkway, but the architecture here seemed to compress inward. Then the GPR screen registered it. A shallow but distinct anomaly. Elias stopped, his heart rate unchanged but his focus sharpening to an absolute point. The screen showed a pocket of material about 6 feet wide and 8 feet tall, placed directly behind the current layer of brick. The density reading was slightly softer than the surrounding bedrock, suggesting an interior filled with disturbed earth, or perhaps a small enclosed air pocket. He carefully ran the GPR again, slowly tracing the outline. The anomaly was clearly defined, a rectangular shape that suggested a deliberately filled-in doorway or passage. More importantly, the brickwork directly covering this spot was of a slightly different hue and texture than the centuries-old brick beside it. It was uniform, too clean, too precise. It was a patch job. Elias switched off the GPR. The darkness rushed back in, broken only by the sharp light of his lamp. He reached into his satchel for a small, specialized geological hammer. He held the tool lightly, respectfully, and tapped the suspicious brickwork. Just once. Clack. The sound was sharp, brittle, and oddly muffled, lacking the deep, resonant thud that a solid, load-bearing wall should produce. It was the sound of air trapped behind a thin layer of material. He lowered the hammer and stood motionless for several minutes, allowing the immense silence to settle back around him. This was the moment of discovery, and he did not wish to rush its gravity. This sealed portion likely represented the third descent mentioned in the sexton's journal, a passage that was deliberately suppressed, perhaps due to fear, perhaps due to crime, or perhaps because what lay beyond defied the strict order of the Catholic Church's acceptable burial procedures. The sexton's cryptic notes, which Elias had memorized, spoke of the ground that groans below the waterline, and a chamber where the stones are not Christian. These notes had been his sole motivation, his quiet obsession. Elias began the slow, laborious process of removing the newer layer of brick. He used a chisel and the hammer, working not with force, but with methodical, patient pressure. Each chip of mortar, each released brick, fell, with a distinct tink, onto the dirt floor, marking the slow passage of time in the absolute dark. He worked for nearly an hour, his focus so intense that the cold air and the weight of the darkness receded entirely. The brick layer was thinner than he expected, only 3 layers deep. As the last layer gave way, Elias pulled out a final, stubborn brick. The immediate reaction was not a visible change, but a profound olfactory one. A new wave of air, heavy, stale, and fiercely dry, rushed out of the newly opened aperture. This air was fundamentally different from the damp, mineral-scented air of the recorded catacombs. It smelled overwhelmingly of fine, petrified dust, and something faintly metallic, like rusted iron or aged blood. He widened the opening just enough to fit his shoulders through. He then paused, his breathing shallow and slow. Before him was a dark void, absolute and impenetrable. He shone his headlamp through the breach. The beam did not stop at a close wall. It traveled, illuminating an area of space far larger than any of the known vaults. The light revealed a floor of packed earth, not brick, and on that earth, resting undisturbed, lay something covered in a uniform, gray blanket of dust. Elias carefully checked the structural integrity of the surrounding area one last time. Satisfied that the break would not compromise the century-old ceiling, he slid through the opening, landing softly on the dusty, packed floor of the unknown chamber. He was inside the third descent. The chamber was roughly circular, its ceiling much lower and rougher than the finished brickwork of the main catacombs. It felt less like a carefully constructed burial site and more like a repurposed natural cave or a hurriedly dug subcellar from the earliest days of New Amsterdam. He directed his headlamp slowly, deliberately, around the room. The sight was compelling in its stillness. This chamber was not lined with neat crypts. Instead, the walls were rough-hewn stone, and the perimeter was lined with simple wooden boxes, rotted and crumbling, marked not with names but with single, crudely painted symbols. A star, a fishhook, a crescent moon. These were not Christian burials. These were the marginalized, the forgotten, the first tenants of New York, buried before the rules were written down. In the center of the room, on the packed earth, Elias saw the true unsettling anomaly. It was a large, flat, slate-gray stone, perfectly circular, about 5 feet in diameter. It looked like a millstone, yet it was positioned with meticulous care. Around this central stone, arrayed in a precise, equidistant circle, were 7 small, blackened lumps. Elias knelt beside one of the lumps. He did not touch it, but examined it through his light. It was obsidian, a shard of black volcanic glass, sharp and cold, clearly not indigenous to the region. He recognized the shape as similar to artifacts found in isolated Native American burial sites far upstate, or perhaps even brought by early non-English settlers. He slowly moved his light back to the circular stone. Embedded just beneath the thick layer of dust on its surface, he could faintly make out etchings. They were not Latin or English. They were symbols, primitive linear carvings that pulsed with the age and secrecy of the place. He felt no rush of adrenaline, only a profound sense of methodological reverence. This was not a quick discovery for a textbook. This was a slow, quiet entry into a time that the city had tried desperately to erase. Elias spent the next hour documenting the chamber. He used a laser distance meter to record the dimensions, took dozens of photographs of the obsidian shards and the stone markings, and carefully logged the atmosphere. Throughout his work, he listened. He listened for any sound that might explain the sexton's fear of groaning. There was no groan, no whisper, only the absolute suffocating silence of the earth. But as he stood by the circular stone, running his fingers over the dust-covered ancient symbols, he noticed one final, unsettling detail. A faint, almost imperceptible current of air, a cold, sharp draft was flowing across the floor, emanating from a narrow crack beneath the far wall. This current was too strong to be a natural fissure. It suggested a deeper second passage, a hole in the floor of the unknown world. Elias did not dare to open it tonight. He had found the anomaly, proven the existence of the third descent, and documented the forgotten dead. The next step, the deeper path, required more preparation, more tools, and more time. He gathered his gear with the same slow, meticulous care he had used to enter. As he shone his light one last time on the obsidian circle, he felt a weight, the weight of 3 centuries of silence pressing down. Sliding back through the breached wall, he slowly and carefully placed the bricks back into their opening, resealing the passage with temporary supports. He wanted to leave the chamber exactly as he found it, maintaining its eternal stillness. It took him 20 minutes to ascend the stairs. As he reached the top and pushed open the heavy wooden door, the thin, cool air of the cemetery yard greeted him, now thick with the dew of the late night. The city's noise, though muffled, seemed overwhelming after the absolute silence below. Elias Thorne stood beside the black silent wall of Old St. Patrick's, his senses heightened, his hands dusty with the particles of the 18th century. He had descended into the unsettling calm of the yard and found beneath it a quiet terror. He had found the bones of the unwritten history of Manhattan, resting in the absolute dark, awaiting the slow, deliberate movement of a historian who would not rush their ancient story. The city slept above him, utterly unaware of the stillness, the obsidian, and the cold draft flowing from the depths of the earth just meters below its millions of oblivious dreams. He knew with quiet certainty that he would be coming back. The whisper of the third descent was now a permanent echo in his mind. A map, drawn in candlelight and coffee stains. The silence of Elias Thorne's study was a heavy, comfortable thing, broken only by the faint, measured tick of an antique grandfather clock in the hall and the occasional soft shush of turned paper. Dawn had long since broken over Manhattan, painting the high windows of his Gramercy Park apartment with a weak, wintry gray. But Elias worked exclusively under the focused, warm glow of his desk lamp. He was seated at a large mahogany table, meticulously organized, except for the single item dominating the space, the sexton's ledger. It was a brittle, leather-bound volume, its pages thin and foxed, smelling faintly of dried mildew and forgotten oil lamps. The book itself was a piece of history, rescued from a dusty ecclesiastical archive where it had been labeled merely as Accounts Payable, 1840-1845. Elias did not rush its examination. He treated the ledger as if it were a fragile organism, slowly turning the pages with tweezers, his breath held shallow to prevent any unnecessary movement of air. He was searching specifically for the cryptic insertion he had noted months ago, the pages that contained not financial entries, but the tormented personal notes of Bartholomew Finch, the Catacombs keeper during the 1840s. Bartholomew Finch was not a man of high education, but one of deep, persistent superstition. His handwriting was cramped, the ink faded to a deep sepia, often blurring where his hand had presumably trembled, or where a teardrop had fallen long ago. Elias had already transcribed most of the text, detailing Finch's descent into paranoia, spurred by the groans below the waterline. Tonight, however, his focus was on the visual anomaly, the map. Nestled between two pages detailing the purchase of burial shrouds was a folded piece of parchment. It was not glued in, merely tucked, and its fragile state suggested it had been repeatedly handled by anxious fingers. Elias carefully unfolded it using a pair of specialized photographic weights. The map was small, crudely drawn, and utterly lacking in modern cartographic standards. It was drawn not with professional inks, but likely with a piece of charcoal or perhaps ink derived from crushed berries, giving the lines a smudged, uncertain quality. The paper itself bore the clear evidence of its long life. Dark, circular stains where a heavy mug of coffee or tea had sat, and faint smudges where Finch's thumb, probably oily from the lamps, had repeatedly rested. Elias leaned closer, his magnifying glass hovering over the surface. The map did not depict the streets above. It depicted the world below. The known catacomb structure, the main vaults, the cardinal directions, the location of the maintenance shaft, was rendered as a series of neat, predictable boxes and lines. These were the areas Bartholomew Finch understood and controlled. But emanating from the very corner corresponding to the sealed-off tunnel, where Elias had been last night, was a different kind of drawing. It was a freehand scribble, a wild, uncertain spiral that plunged sharply downward. "The third descent," Elias murmured, the words feeling heavy in the quiet room. The spiral ended not in a straight line or another vault, but in an uneven, irregular blob labeled simply the pit. Elias placed a copy of the official 1840 structural blueprint of Old St. Patrick's beside the fragile map. He then painstakingly overlaid the two using a specialized digital tracing table, attempting to harmonize Finch's frantic sketch with the cold geometry of the architects. The discrepancies were profound and telling. Finch's rendering of the established crypts was slightly exaggerated in size, reflecting the fear of confinement. But his drawing of the spiral descent was far too long and deep to be accounted for by the known geology of the area. It suggested not just a deep cellar, but a significant unauthorized excavation, Beside the spiral, Finch had drawn a series of small, repetitive glyphs. They were not letters, but symbols, similar to the primitive carvings Elias had seen on the circular slate stone in the sealed chamber. They were stylized waves, perhaps representing water or sound, and angular pointed shapes resembling the obsidian shards. Elias ran his finger over the coffee stain nearest to the pit. It was a rich dark brown, and its placement was strategic. It seemed to deliberately blot out a word that had been written there, a word that Finch had clearly intended to erase from history. "You covered your tracks well, Bartholomew," Elias whispered to the silent paper. "But fear leaves its own scent." He turned his attention back to the accompanying diary entries near the map. The handwriting in these paragraphs was nearly illegible, the sentences fragmenting under the pressure of Finch's growing terror. "They say the ground is always hungry. The digging never stopped. They asked for more depth than the contract allowed, not for the dead, but for the quiet meetings. But the stones were already taken. Not by God, but by the others, the old ones who sleep under the waterline. The sound is not natural, not the river. It is a slow pulsing, a rhythm that demands silence from the living. I sealed the door. I put the stone over it. Better the lie than the truth that breaks the spirit." Elias reread the final sentence slowly. Better the lie than the truth that breaks the spirit. This confirmed Elias's suspicion that the sealed chamber was not just forgotten, but consciously and fearfully concealed. The motivation seemed twofold: the use of the deep tunnels by powerful Tammany Hall figures for illicit, quiet meetings, as suggested by the mention of the extended digging, and the discovery of something non-Christian, something already taken by the others, a reference to the pre-colonial artifacts and the ritual stone. He focused on the reference to the pulsing rhythm. The sounds Finch had heard were consistent with the very low repeating frequency Elias had planned to record during his next visit. The catacombs were located near the original boundaries of the Collect Pond, a large freshwater body that had been drained and filled in during the early 19th century, the very source of Finch's waterline obsession. Elias meticulously cross-referenced the names in the sexton's financial ledger with historical records of early Manhattan political figures. He found several names associated with Tammany Hall's earliest and most secretive power base, men who were known to conduct business outside the public eye. One specific name, a certain C. von Alstein, a low-level but influential fixer in the 1830s, had a series of unusually large payments listed under special materials and labor in the very month the section was sealed. The payments were too large for simple brickwork. They suggested the purchase of heavy specialized materials, perhaps for excavating deeper, perhaps for burying something massive. Elias's research shifted from the catacombs themselves to the men who had sealed them. He opened another file containing digitized copies of Van Alstyne's personal letters, acquired from a university archive. Van Alstyne's correspondence in the late 1830s began to take on a nervous, almost frantic tone. "The matter below the yard is becoming troublesome. The workmen are murmuring about the stones. They say the ground resists. We have procured the glass, but the symbols persist. It must be closed entirely. Better loss of profit than loss of reputation or sanity." The reference to the glass immediately connected to the obsidian shards Elias had seen near the ritual stone. These men were not merely burying their dead. They were dealing with something they found disturbing, something they attempted to counteract or contain using the volcanic glass, which often held ritualistic significance in various ancient cultures. They had encountered the others and the stones described by Finch, and their response was fear-driven concealment. The weight of the 3,000-word narrative now settled firmly on the slow, meticulous confirmation of the map. Elias spent the subsequent hours drafting a detailed geological overlay, using the known city foundations as a control, and projecting Finch's spiral onto a three-dimensional model of the subsurface. The projection was startling. If Finch's sketch of the descent was accurate, the tunnel did not simply go deeper beneath the cemetery. It angled sharply, running beneath the old path of the collect pond, aiming toward an area that was, in 1840, a fetid, marshy, undeveloped no-man's land near the original shoreline. This suggested that the pit was not an ordinary cellar or crypt. It was a structure dug specifically to connect the established religious grounds, a place of sacred permanence, to the chaotic liminal space of the city's polluted, watery edge, a place of secrecy and disposal. It was a backdoor out of the holy ground and into the forgotten filth of early Manhattan. Elias closed the ledger and gently placed Finch's map back into its folder. The coffee stain now seemed less like an accident and more like a deliberate act of destruction, an attempt by the terrified sexton to destroy the knowledge he couldn't bear. The fear was palpable across the centuries. He looked at the digital model glowing on his screen. The projection of the pit showed a deep, almost spherical void directly beneath, where the city had dumped debris and infill to eradicate the collect pond. If the structure had been dug to the waterline, as Finch suggested, it might even be partially flooded, its contents preserved in anaerobic silt. The next step, the return to the catacombs, was no longer a matter of simple archaeological curiosity. It was an attempt to understand what illicit dealings the Tammany fixer, Van Alstyne, was conducting in the dark, and what ancient power the sexton Finch had so desperately tried to hide with a wall of fresh mortar and a stain of coffee. Elias rose slowly from his desk, stretching muscles stiffened by hours of concentrated stillness. The air in his study felt sterile and safe. He knew that the only way to truly decipher Finch's map was to follow the faint charcoal lines down into the cold, silent truth beneath Old St. Patrick's. The time for study was over. The time for the slow descent into the spiral had arrived. The map, drawn in fear and hidden by stains, demanded its completion. He carefully packed his gear, replacing the GPR with a submersible imaging unit and an industrial-grade rope ladder. He left the map behind, secure in his study. He no longer needed the drawing. The terrifying geometry of the third descent was now burned into his mind. The city outside was fully awake now, its morning cacophony a dull, ignorant roar. Elias Thorne, carrying the weight of a 180-year-old secret, prepared to descend back into the place of absolute stillness, seeking the rhythm that Finch had feared, leading him not only to the dead, but to the bottom of the old waterline and the secrets of the pit, the desolate descent into the perpetual night. The night air had grown sharper, carrying the scent of impending frost, as Elias Thorne returned to the high-shadowed walls of Old St. Patrick's. This time, there was no hesitation. The slow, meticulous study of Bartholomew Finch's map and the frantic notes of C. Van Alstyne had stripped away the academic distance. The underworld was no longer a subject of research, but a tangible, demanding location. He unlatched the heavy, rusting gate to the cemetery yard, the screech of the metal, a temporary, violent rupture in the night's calm. He then proceeded to the small wooden shed, his canvas bag heavier now with specialized recording equipment and the coiled, flexible rope ladder. The brass key turned easily this time, almost welcomingly, as if the lock itself had resigned itself to his intrusion. The maintenance door opened onto the shaft of cold, mineral-scented air. Elias paused on the threshold, a final moment of communion with the living world. The city above was a distant, barely perceptible hum, a great, ignorant beast sleeping on a bed of secrets. He secured his light, checked the tightness of his bootlaces, and began his deliberate descent. The stone staircase was now familiar, yet it felt colder, the air denser, Elias moved with a practiced, almost meditative rhythm. 1 foot down, test the stability. Shift the weight, repeat. He used his free hand to steady himself on the slick, damp wall, feeling the age of the stone seep into his glove. Each step carried him further from the present and deeper into the compressed stillness of history. The light from his headlamp, focused and pure, struggled to illuminate the vastness of the darkness. It was a darkness so absolute, so starved of light, that it felt less like an absence of illumination, and more like a physical presence, a thick velvet pressure against the retinas. This was the perpetual night of the deep earth, a darkness that had remained unbroken since the builders sealed the final stone. As he reached the bottom of the main staircase, the shift in atmosphere was immediate and profound. The narrow passageway, lined with its orderly 19th century crypts, seemed almost cheerful in comparison to the deeper mystery ahead. He walked slowly past the marble slabs, his footsteps again absorbed instantly by the dense air. Elias focused his senses. Sound was misleading here. Every small movement created an echo that bounced and distorted. He concentrated instead on smell and feel. The scent of the known catacombs was a mixture of damp earth, lime mortar, and a dry metallic tinge of old metal from the coffin handles. But as he proceeded down the restricted maintenance corridor, the path to the sealed breach, the air began to change, slowly, imperceptibly. The moisture lessened, and the mineral scent was replaced by that peculiar, ancient dryness he had noted before. It was the scent of arrested decay, of objects that had not seen humidity or warmth for nearly 2 centuries. He reached the section he had breached. The temporary supports were holding fast. He removed them with agonizing slowness, his movements measured to prevent any unnecessary dust or debris from falling and disturbing the equilibrium of the sealed chamber beyond. When the opening was clear, the ancient air of the third descent rushed out again, carrying with it a powerful burst of the signature scent, dry dust and the metallic hint of the obsidian and the ritual stone. Elias slid through the breach. He did not switch off his primary light, but he lowered its intensity, allowing his eyes time to adjust to the specific, dense quality of the chamber's darkness. He first turned his attention to the perimeter. The crude wooden boxes were exactly as he had left them. Their symbols, the star, the fishhook, the crescent moon, staring out from beneath the layer of dust. He walked the circumference of the chamber, his boots sinking slightly into the packed earth floor. His pace was agonizingly slow, his headlamp sweeping the walls in a deliberate, methodical arc. He was examining the walls now, searching for any sign of the digging the sexton and the politician had referenced. The stone here was rough, but he identified clear signs of hasty, irregular tool marks, inconsistent with the finished work of the main crypts. This space had indeed been widened, not finished, but excavated with brute force. He moved to the center of the room, standing beside the large slate-gray circular stone. He knelt and used a soft brush to gently clear the dust from the surface, revealing the primitive, linear markings in better detail. They were too organized to be accidental scratches, yet too unlike any known language to be easily deciphered. They spoke of a ritual, a boundary or a territorial claim that preceded the church and the city itself. Now, he focused on the anomaly that had called him back, the cold draft. It originated from the narrow crack along the rough-hewn floor on the chamber's opposite side. Elias laid his full body flat on the cold, dusty earth, carefully guiding the beam of his lamp into the crevice. It was a tight, horizontal opening, perhaps only 10 inches high. The air was rushing out of it with a persistent cold pressure. He placed a microphone from his recording kit near the opening. He was attempting to capture the pulsing rhythm or groan that had driven Finch to madness. He switched on the high-gain recorder and began his work of silence. For 10 minutes, Elias lay still, listening only to the high, barely perceptible hiss of the recording equipment and the soft, steady rush of the cold air. The profound silence of the chamber was absolute. Yet, as the minutes crawled by, Elias began to perceive something the sexton might have misinterpreted. The rush of air was rhythmic. It wasn't steady, it intensified slightly, then waned, then intensified again, following a slow, almost cyclical pattern. He slowly raised his head and looked at the microphone placement. The source of the rhythm was not an audible groan, but the sound of water displacement. The collect pond, which lay above the path of this tunnel, had been notoriously filled with infill, but the ground was never truly dry. It was possible that the deep tunnel, the pit, was partially submerged, and the rhythmic air exchange was caused by the slow subterranean movement of the lake's long-dormant body. The earth itself was breathing, pushing air out as it took on water. Elias knew the next step was critical and final. He had to enter the crack. He retrieved the flexible rope ladder and a powerful military-grade torch. The crack was too small for him to enter upright. He would have to crawl, dragging his gear behind him. He took his time securing the ladder. He anchored it firmly around a massive, rough-hewn stone pillar in the center of the room. He tested the knots with a slow, powerful pull, ensuring that if the passage below dropped sharply, he would have a safe means of ascent. He turned his headlamp to its lowest setting, saving the battery for the unknown depth. He activated the small, rugged submersible camera and attached its cable to a spool on his belt. Lying on his stomach, he began the slow, tortuous crawl into the dark crevice. The space was incredibly tight. The rough edges of the stone scraped against the thick canvas of his jacket. The dust of the centuries coated his hands and face, dry and suffocating. After perhaps 20 feet of agonizing, shoulder-scraping movement, the passage opened abruptly into a vertical shaft. The rush of air became a torrent. Elias cautiously moved his body to the edge of the opening and shone the military torch downward. The beam of light plunged deep, revealing a smooth, circular wall of dressed stone, unlike the rough-hewn rock of the entrance chamber. This was not a natural fissure. This was a well-constructed shaft descending into the unknown. The light finally struck something, a surface of still, black water far below. The depth was at least 30 feet. Elias realized the true nature of the discovery. The sexton's third descent was not a third layer of crypts. It was a sealed, secret entrance to a massive, submerged cistern, or a purpose-dug well that led to the foundation of the old city, below the waterline of the filled-in collect pond. This was C. Van Alstyne's hidden transit route, the pit that connected the solemnity of the church to the illicit dealings of the waterfront. He slowly, carefully, fed the rope ladder down the shaft. It unspooled, hitting the surface of the black water with a silent, heavy plop. Elias began his final descent. He moved on the rope ladder with professional calm, his focus entirely on the handholds and the slow, rhythmic movement of his body. 30 feet is not a great depth, but descending into absolute darkness above freezing water, in a space that has been sealed for generations, creates a profound sense of isolation. The air grew colder, now mingled with the sharp mineral tang of the black water beneath him. He felt the cold, still water reach his boots. He stopped his descent, hanging suspended just above the surface. He lowered the submersible camera into the liquid. On the small monitor attached to his wrist, the image was initially black and turbulent. But as the camera settled, a view of the submerged world stabilized. The light from the camera pierced the black water, revealing surprising clarity. The bottom of the shaft was not just dirt. It was paved with rough, irregular stones, the same kind that lined the ritual circle above. And resting on this ancient submerged pavement were large angular objects, appearing to be heavy wooden crates or boxes, secured by thick rusted iron bands. They were perfectly preserved by the cold anaerobic water. The air exchange, the groan, was finally understood. The movement of the groundwater around these submerged crates caused the rhythmic expulsion of air from the sealed shaft. The earth itself was shifting, the hidden evidence of the Tammany fixer. Elias hung suspended, his body numb from the cold, his mind racing with the quiet horror of the discovery. He was floating above a secret cache of illegal or ill-gotten goods, hidden by powerful men beneath the holy ground, preserved by the slow, eternal action of the city's ancient buried water. He slowly pulled the camera back up, careful not to disturb the profound stillness below. He had reached the perpetual night and found its silent, submerged treasure. The ascent was even slower than the descent, a methodical, painstaking climb against gravity. When he finally pulled himself back through the narrow crevice and into the dusty entrance chamber, he was exhausted yet profoundly calm. He looked back at the narrow opening, now the undisputed entrance to the pit. The rhythmic whoosh of air was fainter now, but persistent. He knew that the crates below held the final physical proof that would connect Finch's madness, Van Alstyne's money, and the ritual stones. Elias sealed the breach in the wall again, using the temporary supports. He was careful to erase his boot prints from the dust of the entrance chamber. He left the darkness as he found it, undisturbed, silent, and waiting. As he climbed the long, worn staircase back toward the surface, the cold of the perpetual night slowly receded from his bones, replaced by the cool dampness of the upper crypts. He emerged into the cemetery yard, just before the first hint of morning, the air carrying the distant, first sounds of the waking city. He had descended into the silent, desolate darkness and returned with the profound knowledge of a massive, submerged secret. The whispers were not ghosts, but the quiet, rhythmic breathing of a city hiding its crime beneath its faith. The next stage would require not descending, but retrieving the unmarked vault and the wall of mortar. The silence of the lower crypts was no longer a void to Elias Thorne. It had become a language. After his initial discovery of the third descent, the air in the recorded sections of Old St. Patrick's felt thinner, less substantial, as if the stones themselves were merely a facade for the heavy truth resting behind them. Tonight, the city above was engulfed in a rhythmic autumn rain, the kind of steady, monochromatic downpour that turns Manhattan into a world of gray reflections. Down here, however, the only rain was the occasional, patient drip of condensation from a limestone arch, a sound that measured the passage of hours with the precision of a water clock. Elias stood before a section of the northern wall that had troubled him for weeks. According to the 1839 survey of the cathedral's foundation, this area should have been a solid structural pier, a massive block of schist and mortar designed to support the weight of the nave above. But as Elias moved his hand across the surface, he felt a subtle, thermal inconsistency. One specific patch of brick, roughly the size of a service store, was several degrees colder than the surrounding masonry. He set his lantern on a low stone ledge, its amber glow casting long dancing shadows that stretched into the rows of stacked coffins behind him. He began his work with a deliberate, almost ritualistic slowness. To the casual observer, he was merely a man standing in a basement, but to Elias, this was a dialogue with a mason who had been dead for over a century. He was looking for the signature of the man who had hidden the vault. Most of the cathedral's lower walls were bonded with a coarse, sandy mortar, typical of the early 1800s, a mixture that had cured into a light, crumbly gray. But here, in this unmarked corner, the mortar was different. It was dark, dense, and had a high concentration of ash, a technique often used by harborside masons to create a waterproof seal against the rising tides of the nearby Collect Pond. "You weren't building a wall for the church," Elias whispered, his voice barely a breath in the still air. "You were building a dam." He took out a small, fine-edged chisel and a wooden mallet. He did not strike the wall with force. Instead, he placed the chisel against a joint and gave it a soft, rhythmic tap. Clink, clink, clink. He listened to the pitch of the vibration. A solid wall would produce a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards. This wall produced a sharp, hollow thwack, the sound of a thin shell protecting a hollow heart. Hours passed in the rhythmic labor of removal. Elias worked brick by brick, not wanting to cause a collapse that might alert the surface or damage what lay within. He felt like a surgeon performing a delicate operation on time itself. As the first brick came free, a puff of stagnant air escaped, the breath of 1845, trapped in a tomb of brick and ash. It carried the scent of old kerosene and burnt tallow, the lingering remains of the last lamp that had flickered in this hidden space before the final brick was tapped into place. Beyond the mortar lay not earth, but a secondary wall. This was the unmarked vault. Unlike the public crypts, which were adorned with marble and ornate ironwork, this vault was a brutalist construction of rough-cut schist. There were no names, no dates, and no crosses. It was a space designed for anonymity. Elias widened the breach, his muscles aching from the sustained, slow movement, until he could shine his light into the interior. The vault was shallow, perhaps only 4 feet deep, and contained a single, massive, iron-bound chest. The wood of the chest had long since rotted away, leaving only the rusted skeleton of its frame and a pile of dark, pulverized organic matter. But it wasn't the chest that caught Elias's attention. It was the wall behind the chest. This back wall was not stone. It was a solid, smooth face of poured lead and lime mortar. A wall of mortar so thick and impenetrable that it seemed to vibrate with a low-frequency hum. This was the barrier Bartholomew Finch had described as the shield against the groan. Elias knelt in the narrow space, his light reflecting off the dull gray surface of the leaden wall. He realized then that the vault was merely an antechamber, a decoy designed to satisfy anyone who might accidentally stumble upon the hollow space. The iron chest was a distraction, likely filled with ledgers or mundane records to make the room appear like a simple, forgotten storage unit. But the wall of mortar was something else entirely. It was an industrial-grade seal. He pressed his ear against the cold lead. In the absolute silence of the catacombs, he began to hear it, not a groan, but a rhythmic, subterranean throb. It was the sound of the city's ancient water table, the ghost of the collect pond, pressing against this man-made dam. And beneath the sound of the water, there was a faint, metallic scraping, like something heavy shifting slowly in a current. Elias realized that this wall was the only thing standing between the sacred ground of the cathedral and the pit he had glimpsed in the sexton's map. The Tammany politicians hadn't just used these tunnels, they had fortified them against the very earth they were violating. He sat back on his heels, his hands covered in the gray dust of the 19th century. The task ahead was no longer about archaeology. It was about engineering. To go further meant breaking a seal that had been designed to hold back the weight of New York's forgotten geography. He looked at the wall of mortar and felt a profound sense of the unsettling calm he had first perceived in the yard above. The peace of the cemetery was maintained by this hidden iron-willed barrier. He decided, with his usual measured calm, that he would not break the wall tonight. He needed to understand the structural implications of breaching a lead-lined seal so close to the water table. He began the slow process of covering his tracks, replacing the outer bricks and dabbing the joints with a mixture of soot and clay to mimic the aged mortar. As he worked, he felt the eyes of the past upon him, the mason who had poured the lead, the politician who had paid for the silence, and the sexton who had died in fear of what lay on the other side. Elias Thorne was now the fourth man in this chain of secrets. He emerged from the catacombs as the gray morning light began to filter through the rain. The city was waking up, its millions of residents walking over the very spot where he had just stood, separated from a submerged, lead-sealed mystery by only a few feet of stone and a century of collective amnesia. The wall of mortar remained silent and pulsing, waiting for the day the historian's chisel would finally let the water back in. The air that has not moved since the Civil War. The return to the northern wall was a silent affair. The rain that had plagued the city the previous night had settled into a low, clinging mist that blurred the outlines of the skyscrapers, making the 21st century feel as distant and fragile as a dream. Elias Thorne descended the stone stairs of Old St. Patrick's with a new set of tools. An oxygen sensor, a vacuum-sealed sampling flask, and a heavy-duty industrial drill fitted with a diamond-tipped core bit. He reached the unmarked vault and removed the decoy bricks he had placed only 24 hours prior. The iron-bound chest, now a pile of rusted dust in his mind, sat ignored as he faced the lead and lime barrier. This was the true gate. Elias began the drilling process. He did not use the high-speed setting. Instead, he set the drill to its lowest, most rhythmic rotation, a slow, grinding whir-click that echoed through the hollow chambers like a mechanical heartbeat. The lid was soft, resisting with a dull metallic friction that heated the bit. He stopped every few minutes to clear the gray shavings, measuring his progress with a depth gauge. 2 inches, 3 inches, 5. The wall was thicker than he had estimated. It was a shield built to withstand the pressure of an entire city's evolution. Suddenly, the resistance vanished. The drill bit lurched forward into a void. Elias froze. He immediately withdrew the drill and placed his gloved thumb over the small half-inch hole. He felt it. A sharp, sudden pull. A vacuum. The pressure inside the chamber beyond was significantly lower than the atmospheric pressure of the catacombs. For over 160 years, this space had been a hermetically sealed bubble, untouched by the shifting tides of the New York atmosphere. He carefully attached the oxygen sensor to the hole. The readout flickered, then stabilized. The oxygen levels were dangerously low, replaced by a high concentration of nitrogen and ancient heavy carbon dioxide. But it was the smell of the air, if air so still can be said to have a smell, that caught him off guard. He slowly removed his thumb, allowing a tiny controlled stream of the interior air to escape into his nostrils. It did not smell like the damp earth of the upper crypts. It did not smell like the metallic dust of the third descent. It smelled of absolute stasis. It was a scent that was dry, almost sweet, like the inside of a cedar chest that hasn't been opened in a lifetime. It carried the faint, ghostly olfactory signature of 1863. The singed smell of old whale oil lamps, the sharp tang of black powder, and the heavy floral musk of Victorian-era embalming fluids that had long since evaporated into a fine crystalline vapor. "This is the air Lincoln breathed," Elias whispered, the realization settling over him with a profound chill. "This is the air of the draft riots, the air of a city on fire, trapped in a bottle." He waited for the pressures to equalize, a process that took nearly an hour of absolute, motionless waiting. During this hour, Elias sat in the dark, his lantern turned low. He listened to the air whistling softly through the tiny hole, the sound of a century and a half of history slowly exhaling. He imagined the world as it was when this air was trapped, a New York of cobblestones and gaslight. A city divided by war, where men in top hats whispered of gold and betrayal in the very shadows he now inhabited. When the whistling stopped, Elias began the arduous task of widening the hole. He used a hydraulic spreader to slowly crack the lead plating, peeling it back like the skin of a prehistoric fruit. As the opening grew large enough for his headlamp to penetrate, he saw it. The chamber beyond was not a rough-hewn cave. It was a meticulously finished room, lined with dark, polished mahogany wood, a material that should have rotted decades ago, but had been preserved by the lack of oxygen. The wood glowed a deep, bruised red in his light. He stepped through the opening. The floor was covered in a layer of fine gray dust, so undisturbed it looked like a carpet of velvet. Elias moved with exaggerated slowness, his feet barely lifting off the ground, desperate not to stir the sediment of the 1860s. He felt like a diver on the floor of a deep, forgotten ocean. Every movement felt heavy. Every breath felt like a theft. In the center of this mahogany-lined room stood a desk. On the desk sat a half-empty glass of what appeared to be amber liquid, now reduced to a sticky, resinous film at the bottom, and a single unlit cigar, its ash perfectly intact as if it had been set down only moments ago. This was not a tomb. It was an office, a subterranean headquarters for the men who truly ran New York during the Civil War. On the far wall, a large map of the United States was pinned, but it was not a map Elias recognized. It showed the Union and the Confederacy, yes, but it was overlaid with a complex web of hand-drawn lines connecting New York to the southern ports of Charleston and Savannah. These were the lines of the blockade runners, the secret economic arteries that kept the city's elite wealthy while the rest of the nation bled. Elias realized that the Third Descent and the Pit were parts of a much larger machine. The Catacombs hadn't just hidden the dead. They had hidden the living machinery of a secret government. The groans heard by the sexton weren't ghosts. They were the sounds of heavy crates of southern cotton and northern gold being moved through the submerged tunnels below the waterline, far beneath the reach of federal inspectors. He walked toward the desk, his heart thudding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. On the blotter lay a single sheet of paper, held down by a brass weight in the shape of a phoenix. The ink was as black and fresh as the day it was written. July 13th, 1863. The fires have reached 2nd Avenue. The mobs are distracted. Move the final shipment from the pit to the yard before the sun rises. If the cathedral is breached, seal the lead. Let the water take the rest. We will wait for the air to clear. Elias looked at the date. July 13th, 1863. The first day of the New York draft riots, the bloodiest civil insurrection in American history. While the city above was being torn apart by violence and fire, the men in this room were calmly moving their wealth through the quiet dark of the catacombs. He stood in the center of the room, surrounded by the air that had not moved since that terrible day. He felt the weight of the silence. It was a silence earned by blood and maintained by lead. He didn't touch the cigar. He didn't touch the glass. He simply stood there, a witness to a moment of frozen time. The air was beginning to change now. The modern atmosphere he had let in was swirling with the ancient vapors, diluting the smell of the Civil War. The vacuum was gone. The secret was breathing again. Elias Thorne turned his light toward the floor behind the desk. There, hidden by the mahogany paneling, was a small, brass-handled trapdoor. It was labeled in the same spidery hand as the sexton's ledger, to the lower pump. He knew that beneath that door lay the water, the crates, and the final truth of the pit. But for now, he simply stood in the room of mahogany and dust, breathing the dying gasps of the 19th century, watching the dust motes of the present dance in the air of the past. He would stay here for hours, just watching. In the slow, sleep-inducing stillness of the deep earth, Elias Thorne had found the heart of the city's darkness, and it was as quiet as a held breath. A lantern casts shadows on the bones of the forgotten. The mahogany room, with its frozen cigar and Civil War ghosts, felt like a stage set once Elias opened the brass-handled trapdoor. The air that rose from the hatch was not dry like the office above. It was thick, humid, and carried the heavy mineral scent of wet lime and prehistoric mud. Elias lowered his lantern first, tied to a length of twine. The amber flame flickered violently as it met the draft, then settled, casting long skeletal shadows against the walls of the shaft. He followed, descending a series of iron rungs that had been hammered directly into the bedrock. Each rung was slick with a fine, translucent moss that felt like cold silk under his gloves. He reached the bottom, and for a moment, he simply stood still, allowing the silence to reassert itself. He was no longer in the cathedral's basement. He was in a natural limestone fissure that predated the city, the church, and perhaps even the arrival of man on the island of Manhattan. But the cavern had been modified. The walls were lined with wooden racks, similar to those found in the wine cellars of European estates. But these racks did not hold bottles. They held bones. Elias raised his lantern and the shadows danced in a grotesque ballet across the limestone ceiling. These were not the neat labeled remains of the upper catacombs. These were thousands of bones, femurs, ribs, and skulls, stacked with a terrifying, utilitarian efficiency. There were no coffins here, no nameplates, no crosses. He moved closer to one of the racks. The bones were stained a deep, earthy ochre from the mineral-rich water that occasionally flooded the chamber. He noticed a small leaden tag tied to one of the skulls with a piece of rotted twine. He wiped the grime away with his thumb. It bore only a number, 842. "The Forgotten," Elias whispered. His breath hitched in the heavy air. As he walked deeper into the cavern, the scale of the shipment, mentioned in the Civil War letter, became clear. During the 1860s, New York was a city of immense growth and equally immense death. The poor, the immigrants who died on the docks, the unidentified victims of the draft riots, they were a logistical problem for a city trying to project an image of gilded progress. The Tammany Hall fixers and the men in the mahogany office had found a solution. Instead of paying for expensive burials in the overcrowded public cemeteries, they had used the Third Descent as a mass disposal site. The shipments were people. Thousands of lives reduced to numerical tags and stacked in the dark to make room for the rising skyscrapers above. Elias's lantern light caught something different at the far end of the chamber. Amidst the sea of brown and ochre bones, there was a patch of brilliant white. He stepped over a pile of collapsed wooden slats and knelt, resting in a small natural alcove were the remains of what appeared to be a mother and child. They had not been stacked like the others. They were laid out on a bed of river stones, their fingers intertwined, even in death. Around them, the others mentioned by the sexton, the obsidian shards, were arranged in a protective circle. Elias realized then that this cavern had been a sacred site long before the cathedral was built. The indigenous people of the island had used this fissure for centuries, treating the deep earth as a womb for their ancestors. The Civil War fixers hadn't just used the space for disposal. They had desecrated an ancient sanctuary to hide their political filth. The shadows cast by his lantern seemed to take on lives of their own. As the flame moved, the eye sockets of the thousands of skulls seemed to track his progress. It wasn't a feeling of malice, but of a profound collective yearning. The silence was no longer empty. It was a choir of the unacknowledged. He noticed a small rusted iron box tucked beneath the rack, marked with the number 842. He opened it slowly, the hinges screaming in the quiet. Inside was not gold or ledger books, but a collection of personal effects. A brass thimble, a lock of red hair tied with a ribbon, a small wooden toy horse, and a series of letters written in Irish Gaelic, never mailed, their ink blurred by the tears of someone who had died waiting for a home that never arrived. Elias Thorne, a man who dealt in the cold facts of history, felt a tear track through the dust on his own cheek. The unsettling calm was finally broken. The catacombs were not a mystery to be solved. They were a debt to be paid. He stayed in that chamber for hours, moving his lantern slowly from rack to rack, ensuring that for at least one night light touched every single one of the forgotten. He recorded the numbers, the symbols and the layout of the ancient burial, his movements as reverent as a priest's. When he finally climbed back through the trapdoor and into the mahogany office, he looked at the map on the wall with a new, burning clarity. The lines of trade weren't just about cotton and gold. They were about the commodification of the human soul. He emerged into the upper church just as the first morning light hit the stained glass windows, painting the floor in shades of ruby and sapphire. The congregation would soon arrive to pray for the dead, never knowing that the true weight of the city's soul lay 60 feet beneath their pews, stacked in the dark, tagged with numbers and guarded by obsidian shards. Elias Thorne walked out into the cool New York morning. He knew what he had to do. The wall of mortar had been breached, the air of the Civil War had been breathed, and the shadows had been cast. Now, the forgotten demanded a name. The Journal of the Sexton's Keeper, a fear of echoes, Dr. Elias Thorne returned to his study, but the mahogany office and the cavern of bones followed him like a persistent fever. The city outside his window was a blur of neon and movement, yet his mind was anchored 60 feet below the soil. He had found the what, the bones, the office, the secret trade, but he still lacked the why. Why did a simple church sexton, a man of faith, allow his sanctuary to become a warehouse for the discarded? He turned his attention back to the sexton's ledger, but this time he looked beneath the leather binding. He had noticed a slight thickness in the back cover, a stiffness that didn't match the front. With a steady hand and a surgical scalpel, he carefully peeled back the inner fabric. Tucked into a secret pocket was a second, smaller book, a diary bound in rough goatskin, its pages stained not by coffee, but by the salt of sea spray and the soot of 1,000 candles. This was the private mind of Bartholomew Finch. The entries began in 1838, a year of relative peace. Finch wrote of the garden, the price of tallow, and the comfort of the liturgy. But, as the years progressed toward the 1840s, the handwriting began to change. The letters became elongated, the ink heavier, as if he were pressing the nib into the paper with desperate force. October 12, 1841. The men from the hall came again tonight. They do not enter through the gates. They come through the water gate, by the old pond. They bring crates that do not rattle. They bring shipments that do not breathe. I am told to look at the stars and not at the shovel. They pay in gold that feels cold, even by the fire. Elias read the words slowly, the rhythm of Finch's guilt echoing in the quiet of his apartment. The sexton wasn't a villain. He was a hostage to the city's burgeoning corruption. Tammany Hall, the political machine of the era, had realized that the church's immunity from civil inspection made it the perfect vault. As Elias turned the pages, a recurring theme emerged. The echoes. January hour, 1842. It is not the sound of the crates that keeps me from sleep. It is the echo. Down in the third descent, the sound of a footstep does not die. It travels, it circles the ritual stone, and comes back as a whisper. Tonight I heard my own name whispered from the darkness of the lead wall. But it was not my voice. It was the voice of the boy from the docks, the one with the red hair and the wooden horse. I saw him tagged today. Number 842. Why does his echo remain when his breath is gone? The journal described a phenomenon Elias had only begun to sense. The catacombs, with their unique limestone geometry and subterranean water currents, acted as an acoustic chamber. Sounds, especially rhythmic ones, could be trapped, bouncing through the fissures for years. To a man like Finch, living alone in the silence, these acoustic anomalies became ghosts. The entries grew more frantic, as the 1840s bled into the 1850s. Finch began to record the sounds of the earth with scientific obsession. He noted the exact time of the groans, correlating them with the tides of the East River and the rainfall over the Collect Pond. He was trying to rationalize his fear, to turn the supernatural into the geological. August 19th, 1844. The groan lasted 3 minutes today. It is deeper now, vibrating in the marrow of my teeth. The politicians say it is the shifting of the filled dirt. I know better. It is the weight of the forgotten. We have stacked them too high. The earth is protesting the burden of the unmourned. I have begun to place the glass shards, the obsidian I found in the deep fissure. The old people said they hold the light. Maybe if I give them light, they will stop whispering. Elias paused. The obsidian shards weren't part of the Tammany conspiracy. They were Finch's desperate attempt at an exorcism. The sexton had reached back into the ancient, indigenous history of the land to find a way to quiet the modern horrors he was complicit in hiding. The final entry was written in 1845, just days before Finch's recorded death from a wasting of the spirits. The handwriting was almost illegible, a frantic scrawl that occupied only the center of the page, surrounded by vast white space. I am the keeper of the silence. But the silence has found a voice. It is a slow, pulsing rhythm. It says, "We are here." It says, "We are New York." I cannot seal the echo. I can only seal the door. If anyone finds this, do not listen to the rhythm. The rhythm is the truth, and the truth is a weight no man can carry and remain upright. May God forgive the city for what it built on. May God forgive me for holding the candle. Elias closed the journal. The room felt colder. The unsettling calm he had first perceived in the yard was the result of Finch's final act of desperation, sealing the wall of mortar to drown out the echoes of the thousands he had helped to bury. The sexton's fear of echoes wasn't a madness of the mind, it was a madness of the soul. He had heard the collective heartbeat of the marginalized, a rhythm that was still pulsing beneath the pavement of 21st century Manhattan. Elias looked at his recording equipment. He had captured that same rhythm on his high-gain microphone. He had called it water displacement. Finch had called it the truth. As the sun began to rise over the city, Elias realized that his exploration was no longer about discovery. It was about release. The echoes had been trapped for 180 years, bouncing between the mahogany walls and the obsidian shards. It was time for the sexton's burden to be lifted. It was time for the echoes to reach the surface. He began to pack his bag for his final descent. He didn't bring a drill or a chisel this time. He brought a speaker. If the catacombs could trap a sound, maybe they could also broadcast one. He would give the forgotten their voice back. The city was waking up, a million footsteps hitting the sidewalk, each one creating a new echo. Somewhere 60 feet below, Bartholomew Finch's ghost was still listening, waiting for the silence to finally be broken. Tracing the cold path of the Manhattan waterways, the city of New York is a vertical marvel, but its soul has always been horizontal, defined by the movement of water. To the millions living above, the island is a solid mass of concrete and steel. To Elias Thorne, it was increasingly becoming a sieve, a honeycomb of forgotten streams and buried canals. Following the clues in Bartholomew Finch's journal, Elias realized that the pit and the third descent were not isolated chambers. They were stations on a hidden nautical highway. The Watergate, mentioned by Finch, refers to a specific, lost piece of Manhattan geography, the subterranean connection between the catacombs and the remnants of the Collect Pond. Elias stood in the room of the forgotten, the cavern of bones, holding a thermal imaging camera. He was no longer looking for bricks or lead. He was looking for the movement of heat. Or rather, the absence of it. He tracked the cold. A narrow ribbon of freezing air and moisture snaked along the western wall of the limestone fissure, indicating a hidden channel, where water was still actively circulating. He followed this cold path with the patience of a shadow, The terrain changed as he moved away from the cathedral's foundation. The rough limestone gave way to ancient hand-hewn timber pilings, blackened cedar logs driven into the muck in the 1830s to stabilize the ground. These were the bones of the city itself, the rotting skeletons of early civil engineering. The air grew heavy with the smell of anaerobic mud and ancient river silt. This was the scent of the old Manhattan water table, a smell that hadn't seen the sun in nearly 2 centuries. As Elias waded through ankle-deep crystalline water, he noticed the walls were now lined with brick, not the neat ecclesiastical brick of the church, but the oversized, irregular clinker bricks used in industrial sewers and canal locks. He had found the Minetta Brooks ghost, or perhaps a diverted branch of the Canal Street sewer. As he moved deeper, the pulsing rhythm he had recorded grew louder. It wasn't a whisper here. It was a rhythmic, mechanical thump-slosh, thump-slosh. He rounded a corner, and his lantern illuminated a massive iron gate, half submerged in the dark water. This was the Water Gate. It was a sophisticated piece of Victorian machinery, a tide-locked sluice gate designed to allow small, flat-bottom boats to enter the tunnels from the river at high tide, then remain hidden as the water receded. This was how the Tammany Hall fixers moved their cargo. They didn't use the church's front doors. They used the tide. Elias touched the iron gate. It was coated in a thick, protective layer of grease and silt, preserving the metal. Beside the gate, he found a series of rusted iron rings bolted into the masonry, mooring points for the shipments that arrived in the dead of night. He realized the genius of the architecture. The politicians had used the natural hydrology of the island to create a perfect invisible logistics network. By following the cold path, they could move contraband and people from the bustling docks of the East River directly into the heart of the city's most sacred ground without ever being seen on a public street. Elias followed the canal's path beyond the gate, the ceiling dipping so low he had to crouch. He was now walking beneath the foundations of what was once the most crowded tenement district in the world. Above him, a century and a half ago, thousands lived in squalor, never knowing that a silent river of secrets was flowing beneath their floorboards. He discovered a small, dry alcove near a junction in the brickwork. Inside, he found a discarded boathook and a wooden crate marked with the seal of the New York Evening Post, 1862. Inside the crate were not newspapers, but hundreds of forged exemption papers for the Civil War draft, the very documents that allowed the wealthy to avoid the slaughter that the poor, tagged as numbers in the cavern behind him, could not. The Watergate was the bridge between the pit of suffering and the office of profit. Elias sat in the damp alcove, watching the black water ripple in his light. He felt the cold path winding its way toward the Hudson and the East River, a dark circulatory system that had never been purged. The city above was built on the diversion of these waters, but you can never truly kill a river. It simply goes underground, carrying the debris of history with it. He realized that his exploration was nearing its end. He had traced the money, the buns, the politics, and now the root. The whispers were the echoes of the tide hitting the iron gate, the sound of the city's hidden history trying to flow back to the sea. Elias Thorne rose, his boots splashing softly in the ancient silt. He would follow the water back to the cathedral, back to the surface. He had seen the how and the where. The cold path had led him to the final truth. Manhattan was not built on rock. It was built on a submerged, liquid lie. As he began the slow trek back, the rhythmic thump of the tide gate seemed to synchronize with his own heartbeat. He was a part of the cold path now, a carrier of the secret. The unnatural silence below the 5 Points slums, as Elias Thorne continued his westward trek along the cold path of the subterranean waterways. The character of the masonry changed once more. The organized brickwork of the cathedral's drainage gave way to a chaotic patchwork architecture. Here, The walls were composed of mismatched stones, salvaged timber, and even discarded ballast from ships. This was the foundation of the 5 Points, the most infamous slum in American history, a place where the sunlight of the 1850s rarely touched the ground, and where, apparently, the silence of the earth was even more profound. Above Elias's head, according to his internal compass, was the intersection of Anthony Cross and Orange Street. In the mid-19th century, this was a whirlpool of human misery, a crowded, violent district of tenements built over the decaying filth of the filled-in Collect Pond. But down here, 40 feet below the former swamp, there was an unnatural silence. In the other sections of the catacombs, there were the sounds of the city, the low hum of the subway, the vibration of heavy trucks, the rhythmic groan of the water table. But beneath the 5 Points, the earth felt dead. The soil here was so saturated with ancient industrial runoff, tannery chemicals awful from the old slaughterhouses and the compacted debris of a million lives, that it seemed to act as a perfect acoustic insulator. It was a silence that didn't just lack sound, it felt like it was actively swallowing it. Elias stopped, his lantern light reflecting off the wall that was oozing a thick, black substance, the tar of history. He noticed that the tunnel had widened into a series of low-ceilinged chambers. These were not crypts or offices. They were the rookeries of the deep. Small, rotted wooden partitions divided the space into tiny stalls. In each stall, Elias found the remnants of desperate habitation: a rusted spoon, a broken clay pipe, a single leather shoe. These were the illegal sub-basements where the poorest of the poor, those too destitute even for the tenements above, had lived in the dark. They lived beneath the waterline, Elias whispered, the sound of his own voice feeling heavy and flat in the absolute silence. He realized that the Tammany Hall Watergate was not just a shipping route for goods. It was a filtration system for people. The shipments of the forgotten he had seen in the cathedral's cavern were likely harvested from these very stalls. When a tenant in the 5 Points sub-basements died, they weren't taken to a cemetery. They were simply pushed through a hole in the wall and into the third descent. The silence here was unnatural, because it was the silence of a void where thousands of voices had been intentionally extinguished. Elias moved toward a larger central chamber, where the ceiling was reinforced with massive iron plates. He found a series of tally marks scratched into the stone wall. Beside the marks was a name, carved with a steady, literate hand: the Dead Rabbit. This was a reference to one of the most feared gangs of the era. It suggested that the criminal underworld and the political machine were not just partners. They shared the same basement. The silence was a tactical necessity. In this soundproofed underworld, the gangs could meet, the fixers could pay bribes, and the screams of the shipments would never reach the ears of the police on the surface. As Elias explored the perimeter of this central room, he found a hidden staircase, not stone or iron, but a rickety wooden ladder leading upward into a narrow chimney. He climbed slowly, his lantern swinging rhythmically. At the top, he didn't find a door, but a heavy wooden floorboard. He pushed against it gently. It shifted. He peered through the crack and saw the interior of a dusty, abandoned storefront. A faded sign on the window, seen from behind, read, "Old Brewery, Missions and Lodgings." The circle was complete. The Old Brewery was the heart of the 5 Points, a place of supposed charity that sat directly atop the most efficient mass burial and smuggling operation in the city. The silence below was the foundation upon which the chaos above was built. Elias descended the ladder back into the unnatural quiet. He felt a profound sense of claustrophobia, not from the physical space, but from the moral weight of the architecture. Every stone was a witness to a transaction of human life. He turned his light toward the floor, where a small silver object glinted in the dust. He picked it up. It was a tontine token, a piece of metal used in a dead man's lottery, a popular and cruel gambling game of the 19th century slums. On the back was engraved "Last One Standing." The silence of the 5 points wasn't an accident of geology. It was a monument to the last one standing, the politicians and criminals who thrived while the city literally buried its problems beneath their feet. Elias Thorne began his long, slow walk back toward the cathedral. He was leaving the unnatural silence of the slums behind, but he carried the dead rabbit tally marks and the tontine token in his pocket. The whispers were getting louder now, even in the silence. They were no longer echoes. They were a demand for justice. He had reached the 9th level of his exploration, and the heart of the city's darkness was no longer a secret. It was a crime scene. In this 10th chapter, the journey reaches its spiritual and metaphysical core. Dr. Elias Thorne moves away from the political corruption of the 5 points and returns to the very first chamber he discovered, the site of the ancient stones. This section, the chamber of the ritual circle and the obsidian shards, is designed to be read with a sense of hushed, ancient reverence, focusing on the intersection of geology, pre-colonial history, and the inexplicable. The whispers, deep within the New York Catacombs, X, the chamber of the ritual circle and the obsidian shards. Elias Thorne retreated from the filth of the 5 points, his boots heavy with the literal and figurative grime of the slums. He sought the 3rd descent once more, drawn back to the circular room that sat like a silent eye in the center of the subterranean storm. If the Watergate was the city's throat and the mahogany office was its brain, this chamber, with its ritual circle and obsidian shards, was undoubtedly its heart. He entered the room slowly, his lantern light washing over the rough-hewn walls. The air here felt different than the stagnant vacuum of the Civil War office or the humid rot of the 5 points. It was vibrant, almost electric, carrying a faint scent of ozone and cold flint. The dust he had disturbed days ago had resettled with an unnatural precision, as if the room itself were attempting to maintain a perfect, ancient symmetry. Elias knelt at the perimeter of the circle. He took out a soft brush and a magnifying glass, beginning a forensic examination of the obsidian shards. There were 7 of them, each roughly the size of a human palm, carved into sharp, geometric wedges. Obsidian, volcanic glass, does not occur naturally in the bedrock of Manhattan. These stones had traveled thousands of miles, likely through ancient trade routes that existed long before the first European sail appeared on the horizon. As he brushed away the silt, he noticed that the shards weren't just placed on the ground. They were embedded in silver-lined sockets carved directly into the schist floor. "Conductivity," Elias whispered. He realized the shards were positioned to catch the very low-frequency vibrations of the underground water currents he had been tracking. The obsidian acted as a bridge, a series of lithic resonators that translated the groans of the earth into something tactile. He moved his light to the central stone, the massive, slate-gray, circular slab. Now that he knew about the pit below, he understood that this stone was a cap, a seal, placed over the vertical shaft leading to the submerged crates. But the carvings on the surface told a deeper story. They were not just symbols. They were a map of the stars as they appeared over Manhattan 3,000 years ago. The central point of the carving aligned perfectly with the North Star, while the radiating lines pointed toward the original springs that fed the collect pond. This wasn't a site of disposal for the Tammany politicians. They had merely co-opted it. Long before the politicians used the pit to hide their gold, an ancient culture, perhaps the ancestors of the Lenape, had identified this spot as a thin place, a location where the veil between the world of the living and the spirit of the earth was at its most porous. Elias sat cross-legged on the dirt floor, turning off his primary lantern. He sat in the dim secondary glow of a chemical light stick, allowing his eyes to adjust to the true shadows. In the near darkness, the obsidian shards began to exhibit a faint phosphorescent quality. They weren't glowing with light, but they seemed to be refracting the invisible energy of the city's hum. He placed his bare hand on the central stone. The vibration was no longer a groan. It was a pulse. Thump, thump, thump. It was the heartbeat of the island, a slow geological rhythm that was being amplified by the obsidian. Elias closed his eyes and felt the images bloom in his mind. The pristine forests of Mannahatta, the clear waters of the pond before the tanneries, the silent processions of people who treated this earth as a living deity rather than a real estate commodity. He realized the true fear of the sexton, Bartholomew Finch. Finch hadn't just been afraid of the shipments of dead bodies. He had been afraid because the obsidian shards were reacting to the violence of the city above. When the draft riots broke out, when the thousands were tagged and stacked, the ritual circle didn't just sit silent. It absorbed the trauma. The echoes Finch heard were the obsidian shards replaying the suffering of the city, trapped in a loop of volcanic glass. The Tammany fixers, in their arrogance, thought they were using a secret basement, but the obsidian shards were the real keepers of the record. Every bribe, every murder, every forgotten life had been etched into the energetic frequency of this room. Elias reached into his bag and retrieved the tontine token he had found in the 5 points. He placed it on the central stone. The moment the silver touched the slate, a sharp metallic ping echoed through the chamber. A sound so pure it seemed to cut through the silence like a knife. The obsidian shards vibrated in response, their dull surfaces momentarily flashing with a dark inner fire. The room was purging itself. Elias Thorne felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of peace. The unsettling calm was gone, replaced by a profound clarity. He understood now that his task was not to expose a crime, but to complete the circle. The forgotten needed to be acknowledged, and the ancient stones needed to be released from their service as a warehouse for the city's sins. He spent the rest of the night in the chamber, documenting every symbol and every shard with a reverence that surpassed his scientific training. He was no longer just an archaeologist. He was a witness. When he finally emerged from the third descent, the obsidian shards seemed to dull behind him, their work for the night finished. Elias walked through the cathedral pews as the first morning light hit the altar. He looked at the ornate gold and marble of the church and realized it was all a fragile shell. The true power, the true history, and the true memory of New York lay in the dark, vibrating in the glass shards, waiting for someone to finally listen to the rhythm of the earth. He had reached the 10th station of his journey. The heart was open, and the whispers were finally becoming a song. The private letters of a Tammany Hall politician. While the catacombs offered sensory horrors, it was the archives that provided the motives. To understand the pit, Elias Thorne had to understand the mind of Cornelius Van Alstyne, a man whose name appeared in no history books but whose fingerprints were all over the foundation of the city. Elias sat in the reading room of a private historical society, the air thick with the scent of old paper and beeswax, staring at a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon of black silk. These were the confessional letters, a collection of private correspondence from Van Alstyne to his silent partner in London. Unlike the public records of Tammany Hall, which spoke of charity and civic duty, these letters were written in a tone of weary, clinical pragmatism. Elias donned his white cotton gloves and began to unfold the first letter, dated November 1862. The ink was sharp, the penmanship aggressive. My dear Thorne, no relation to Elias, the draft is coming, and with it a peculiar opportunity. The city is full of surplus men. Irish, Germans, the uncounted. The Union needs soldiers, but the wealthy need their sons at home. We have established the exchange in the cathedral's lower vaults. For $300, a man can buy a substitute. But for $500, he can buy an invisibility. We take the substitute, we tag him, and we move him through the pit. If he dies in the tunnels, he is simply a number. If he lives, he is a ghost we can sell elsewhere. The church provides the cover. The water provides the transit. Elias felt a coldness settle in his chest. The shipments weren't just the dead. They were the living who were being erased for profit. The catacombs were a human clearinghouse. Van Alstyne wasn't just a politician. He was an architect of shadows. He turned to a letter from July 1863, written during the height of the draft riots. The paper was singed at the edges, perhaps rescued from a fire. The streets are in chaos, but the vaults are quiet. The mob is burning the orphanages, which serves our purpose well. More uncounted souls for the racks. We have encountered a small problem, however. The sexton, Finch, is becoming unstable. He speaks of echoes and vibrations. He found the glass stones we uncovered when widening the lower shaft. He thinks they are holy. I know they are merely an obstruction. I have instructed the masons to build the lead wall. We must seal the office and the lower pump before the federal inspectors arrive. The profit is secured, but the silence must be absolute. The small problem of the sexton's sanity was, to Van Alstyne, merely a line item in a budget. The letters revealed a terrifying lack of empathy. To these men, the city was a machine, and the catacombs were the grease that kept the gears turning. Elias traced the names mentioned in the margins. Van Alstyne was connected to the highest levels of the city's judiciary and police. They had created a parallel New York, a subterranean economy where the laws of the surface did not apply. The pit was the ultimate tax haven, a place where even the soul could be hidden from the ledger. The most haunting letter was the final one, dated 1865, just after the war ended. It was a short note, written with a hand that seemed to be trembling. The water is rising in the pit. The pump is failing, and the slow withdrawal and the weight of unseen history. The decision to leave the third descent was not made in a moment of fear, but in a moment of profound saturation. Elias Thorne had become a vessel for a history that New York had spent nearly 2 centuries trying to drown. As he stood for the final time in the mahogany-lined office of the Civil War fixers, the air, once so still and ancient, felt thick, as if the stories of Van Alstyne's greed and Finch's terror had physical mass. He began his withdrawal with the same agonizing slowness with which he had arrived. Archaeology is often seen as an act of taking, but for Elias, this final act was one of restoration. He carefully replaced the brass-handled trapdoor, ensuring the seal was tight. He looked one last time at the cigar and the resinous glass on the desk. They were no longer artifacts. They were indictments. The climb back through the wall of mortar was a test of endurance. Every muscle in his body felt the pull of the earth, as if the catacombs themselves were reluctant to let go of the only living witness they had known in a generation. He moved through the breach he had made, his lantern casting flickering, weary shadows against the leaden seal. He spent an hour meticulously replacing the bricks he had removed, dabbing the new mortar with the dust of the floor, to ensure the unmarked vault looked exactly as it had since 1865. As he reached the main corridor of the recorded catacombs, the weight of the unseen history began to manifest as a physical pressure behind his eyes. He passed the rows of neat marble-fronted crypts, the families whose names were etched in gold and celebrated in the history books above. He looked at them now with a cold, clear clarity. Their status, their clean legacies were built on the silence of the tagged numbers in the cavern below. The city's gilded age was polished with the oil of the pit. Elias stopped at the base of the final stone staircase leading to the surface. He sat on the bottom step, his head in his hands. The silence here was different from the unnatural silence of the 5 points. It was a silence of complicity. He realized that once he climbed these steps, he would be the sole bearer of a truth that could shatter the foundational myths of the city's elite. How does one walk through a modern street, past the skyscrapers and the luxury boutiques, knowing they are anchored in a mass grave of political convenience? He took out his field notebook, his hands trembling slightly as he felt the tontine token in his pocket. He wrote a single sentence. The history we see is merely the skin. The history we feel is the bone. He began the ascent. Each step was a labor. He felt the phantom weight of the thousands of shipments, the Irish immigrants, the draft avoiders, the victims of the riots, clinging to his coat. He wasn't just climbing stairs. He was dragging a forgotten population back into the light of day. As he neared the top, the air began to change. The mineral-heavy cold breath of the deep was replaced by the faint filtered scent of the upper church. Incense, floor wax, and the distant metallic tang of the city's smog. The transition was jarring. The modern world felt thin, loud, and profoundly shallow. He reached the maintenance door and paused. He could hear the muffled sound of a pipe organ practicing in the nave above, a slow, somber Bach chorale. The music, intended to be heavenly, felt like an insult to the rhythmic groan of the Watergate below. Elias turned the brass key for the final time. The lock clicked shut with a sound like a gavel. He emerged into the cemetery yard. It was that blue hour before dawn, when the city is at its most quiet. Yet the skyscrapers are already beginning to glow with the first reflections of the sun. He stood among the tilting headstones of Old St. Patrick's, his clothes covered in the gray dust of the 19th century. To the world passing by on Mulberry Street, he was just a man leaving a church. But inside, Elias Thorne was a walking archive. The slow withdrawal was complete, but the weight had only just begun to settle. He looked at the red brick wall of the cathedral and knew that he could never see it as a simple building again. It was a lid. He walked out of the iron gates and onto the sidewalk. His boots, still damp with the water of the cold path, left faint dark prints on the concrete. Prints that would evaporate in minutes, leaving no trace of where he had been. The history remained unseen by all but him. And as he walked toward his home in the gathering light, Dr. Elias Thorne realized that his real work wasn't the exploration. It was the telling. He had to find a way to make the city feel the weight of its own bones, the scholarly scrutiny, and the skeptic's cold eye. If the catacombs were a world of shadows, the university was a world of harsh, unflinching light. 2 weeks after his final ascent, Elias Thorne stood in a wood-paneled boardroom at Columbia University, facing a committee of his peers. He had come to present his findings, but he realized quickly that he was not being welcomed as a discoverer. He was being examined as a patient. Across the long oak table sat 3 men and 2 women, the gatekeepers of Manhattan's history. At the center was Dr. Alistair Sterling, a man whose career had been built on the official history of the Gilded Age. Sterling's eyes were like polished flint, reflecting a cold skepticism that had dismissed a dozen amateur theories over the decades. Elias began his presentation with the slow, deliberate pace that had characterized his exploration. He laid out the maps, the high-resolution photographs of the obsidian shards, and the digitized transcripts of Cornelius van Alstyne's letters. He spoke of the third descent and the pit, his voice steady despite the weight of the secrets he was attempting to offload. "You are suggesting," Sterling said, his voice a dry rasp, "that beneath one of the city's most prominent religious landmarks lies a mass grave of political convenience, a secret Civil War trade hub, and a pre-colonial ritual site, all of which have gone unnoticed for nearly 2 centuries. I am not suggesting it, Alistair. Elias replied, sliding a photograph of the tagged skull 842 across the table. I am documenting it. Sterling didn't look at the photo. He looked at the dust on Elias's cuff. Archaeology requires more than a rogue entry into a basement and a collection of whispers. Your GPR readings are anomalous, yes, but they could be interpreted as natural seismic shifts or remnants of the original collect pond drainage. As for the mahogany office, without physical artifacts removed for carbon dating and chemical analysis, it remains anecdotal. The skeptic's cold eye was not interested in the rhythm of the earth or the morality of the forgotten. It demanded chain of custody, peer-reviewed verification, and institutional clearance, none of which Elias had. By entering the catacombs without a full city permit, Elias had technically committed a crime. The committee was using his lack of bureaucracy to invalidate his discovery. I have the audio recordings, Elias said, his voice lowering. The rhythm I captured matches the tides of the East River, exactly as described in the Sexton's Journal from 1845. The frequency suggests a void of at least 10,000 square feet. One of the women on the committee, a specialist in urban planning, leaned forward. Dr. Thorne, if what you say is true, the structural implications for Lower Manhattan would be catastrophic. You are implying that the foundation of the city is partially hollowed out by illegal 19th century excavations. The city's legal department would never allow such a claim to be validated. It would bankrupt the historical societies and trigger a dozen federal lawsuits. Elias realized then that the skepticism wasn't just intellectual, it was protective. History in New York was a commodity. The official story was a pillar of the real estate market and the political status quo. To admit the existence of the pit was to admit that the city's wealth was built on a crime scene that was still physically present. The meeting lasted for 4 hours. Elias was questioned on his methodology, his mental state during the isolation of the descent, and his interpretation of the Gaelic letters. Each piece of evidence was picked apart with the clinical coldness of a coroner. The obsidian shards were dismissed as possible ballast stones from a Caribbean merchant ship, and the Civil War Office was suggested to be a forgotten storage cellar for sacramental wine. As he gathered his papers at the end of the session, Dr. Sterling approached him. The older man's face softened for a fraction of a second, but his eyes remained frozen. Elias, he whispered, you are a brilliant man, but you are chasing ghosts. The city is too loud for the kind of whispers you're hearing. Even if you are right, the world doesn't want to know. They want the cathedral, they want the skyscrapers, and they want the dead to stay buried. My advice, burn the notes, return to the surface. The faint frequencies. A sound recording from the void. The university's rejection had left Elias Thorne in a state of clinical clarity. He understood now that the skeptic's cold eye was blind to visual evidence because it was trained to see only what was sanctioned. To break through the wall of academic and political denial, he needed to bypass the eyes and speak directly to the primitive centers of the human brain, the parts that respond to vibration, rhythm, and the deep, low-frequency hum of the earth. He returned to his apartment, which had become a laboratory of the ethereal. The walls were lined with spectral analyzers, seismic sensors, and high-fidelity acoustic recorders. He was no longer just an archaeologist, he was an acoustic forensic scientist. Elias focused on the recording he had captured at the edge of the pit, the rhythmic air displacement he had initially called a groan. He ran the audio through a series of digital filters, stripping away the white noise of the modern city, the hum of the subway, and the distant vibration of the sewer pumps. What remained was a sound that defied easy categorization. It was a frequency below the threshold of human hearing, somewhere between 5 and 15 hertz. It was an infrasound, a frequency that the human body doesn't hear through the ears but feels in the chest and the marrow of the bones. It is the frequency that triggers a sense of dread in animals before an earthquake, the ghost frequency that causes unexplained anxiety in abandoned buildings. As Elias amplified the signal, the rhythm became undeniable. It was a slow repeating cycle: thrum, pause, thrum, pause. It was too regular to be the random shifting of earth, yet too organic to be a machine. "It's not just water," Elias whispered, watching the green lines of the spectral analyzer dance in the dim light of his study. "It's a resonator." He realized that the pit, with its circular stone chamber and obsidian shards, was acting like a giant subterranean flute. As the tide of the East River pushed water through the cold path and into the submerged cistern, air was forced through the narrow fissures, vibrating the obsidian shards. The ancient people who built the circle hadn't just made a ritual site. They had built a harmonic monument to the island's pulse. Elias spent the next 72 hours in a state of wakeful trance. He used a technique called seismic interferometry to map the void using the sound itself. By measuring how the frequency bounced off the different densities of rock, brick, and lead, he began to see the pit through sound. The recording revealed things the camera could not. There were echoes of hollow spaces stretching far beyond the 5 points. A network of forgotten veins that seemed to pulse in synchronization with the cathedral's heart. But most hauntingly, when he slowed the recording down by a factor of 10, the void began to speak. The rhythmic thrumming contained micro-echoes, tiny, high-frequency pings that occurred every time the main pulse hit. These were the sounds of the iron bands on the submerged crates, the rattling of the lead tags on the racks of bones, and the faint scraping of the obsidian against the silver-lined sockets. It was a symphony of the discarded. Elias prepared his final piece of evidence. He created a sonic reconstruction. He didn't just record the sound. He used a series of subwoofers to project the frequency into a container of fine sand. As the frequency of the pit played, the sand began to move, vibrating and shifting until it formed a perfect geometric pattern, a schematic map. The pattern in the sand was identical to the celestial carvings on the ritual stone. The sound of the pit was literally the physical manifestation of the ancient map. The whispers were the architectural code of the city's hidden history, played out in vibration. On the final night of his analysis, Elias sat in the dark, the sub-bass frequency of the pit vibrating through his floorboards. He felt a sense of profound connection. He wasn't just listening to a recording, he was breathing with the city. The skeptics could deny a photograph, and they could dismiss a letter, but they could not deny the vibration that was currently making the water in their own glasses ripple. He knew what he had to do. He wouldn't return to the university. He would go to the cathedral during the midnight mass. He would bring his equipment, and he would play the sound of the void through the church's own sound system. He would make the unmarked vault speak to the living. The frequency was ready. The faint frequencies were now a roar in his mind. The final chapter of the exploration was no longer about discovery. It was about resonance. The city sleeps above the unanswered question. The midnight mass at Old St. Patrick's was a spectacle of light and incense, a staged beauty that seemed to float precariously above the dark truth Elias Thorne had uncovered. He stood in the back of the nave, his coat heavy with the small high-frequency transmitter he had built. He looked at the faces of the worshippers, the tourists, the faithful, the wealthy donors, and he realized they were all participants in a grand collective slumber, They were the city above, and they were content. Elias had intended to broadcast the sound the void, to let the infrasound of the pit rattle the pews and shatter the stained glass. He wanted to force the unanswered question into their ears. What is the cost of your sanctuary? But as the pipe organ began its deep, resonant chords, Elias felt a strange, cooling sensation in his chest. He looked down at his hands, still stained with the dust of the wall of mortar, and he remembered the obsidian shards. He remembered the mother and child in the cavern of bones, resting in their circle of volcanic glass. They hadn't asked for a riot. They had asked for peace. If he broadcast the frequency, he would be no better than Van Alstyne or the rioters. He would be using the forgotten as a weapon. With a slow, deliberate movement, Elias reached into his pocket and switched off the transmitter. The green light faded into darkness. He decided, in that moment, that some secrets are not meant to be solved by the loud, screaming world of the surface. Some secrets are meant to be held. He walked out of the cathedral before the service ended. The air outside was crisp, the sky a deep, bruised purple. He walked toward the iron gates, looking back one last time at the red brick walls. Beneath those bricks, the third descent was still breathing. The water was still pushing through the cold path. The obsidian was still vibrating with the pulse of the island. Elias returned to the unmarked vault one final time. He didn't enter. He simply stood by the wall and placed his forehead against the cold stone. He whispered a name, not his own, but the name of the boy from the docks. Number 802. He felt the vibration, one last time. A soft, rhythmic thrum that seemed to acknowledge his presence. It was the unanswered question of New York. How do we live with what we have buried? Elias Thorne left the Ministry of History that night. He didn't publish his notes. He didn't go back to the university. He moved to a small apartment near the East River, where he could listen to the tides. He became a keeper of a different sort, a man who walks the streets of Manhattan and sees not the buildings, but the voids. The city continues to sleep above the question. The skyscrapers grow taller, the lights grow brighter, and the noise of the present grows louder. But deep below, in the perpetual night of the catacombs, the rhythm remains. The obsidian shards continue to record the city's soul, waiting for the day when the water finally reclaims the pit. Until then, the city sleeps. And in its dreams, if one listens very closely to the silence between the heartbeats of the traffic, one can still hear the faint, pulsing echo of the forgotten. Elias Thorne closes his eyes. He is finally at peace with the silence. The mystery is not gone. It is simply resting. The story ends here, not with an answer, but with a breath. A slow, deep breath of the air that has finally, after a century and a half, moved.